Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Early established himself as a dependable commander at Cedar Mountain and 2nd Manassas. Now we join him and the Army of Northern Virginia as they invade the North for the first time. If you like what I do, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. On the morning of September 17, 1862, Jubal Early and his brigade was on the far left of the Confederate line outside the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. He had been detached from his division, commanded by Alexander Lawton, and now helped support the cavalry commander Jeb Stuart and that general's artillery on Nicodemus Hill. The Battle of Antietam erupted, and Early saw little action until word came to him that Lawton had been seriously wounded, and now he would take command of the entire division. Stonewall Jackson ordered him to bring his brigade to link up with the rest of the division. However, Early didn't do that. He maneuvered his brigade close to the West Woods near the infamous cornfield, then set off to find the rest of the division. The division was a shell of its former self, and Early discovered only part of it, and those parts were mangled from the morning attacks and wouldn't be much good to him now. With a handful of regiments from the division, he set off for his brigade. Union forces that morning attacked through the cornfield, and now turned their attention a little west to the West Woods and the Hagerstown Pike, putting them on a collision course with Early's brigade and what remained of the division. As the Union troops advanced along the pike, Early ordered his men to attack the unsuspecting Federals and cause great havoc in the blue ranks, ultimately driving them from this area and securing the left flank of the Confederate Army around the Dunkard Church. The rest of the day that would become the bloodiest single day in American history, Early remained on the left as the battle shifted toward the Sunken Road and Burnside's Bridge. The next day, both armies stared at one another. Then Lee would eventually begin his move back across the Potomac River and back into Virginia. Early's division brought up the rear of Jackson's line as they moved through the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, where Jackson had won great fame earlier in the year. A humorous story comes out of this time when Jackson sent a note to Early asking why he saw so many troops straggling in the rear of his column. Early responded by telling Jackson that most of the troops he saw were from the divisions in front of him, and the reason the lieutenant general commanding saw so many stragglers in rear of my division today is probably because he rode in rear of my division. Only the irascible and respected Early could get away with such a comment. The new Union commander of the Army of the Potomac, Ambrose Burnside, moved that large army to Fredericksburg, Virginia to begin a push toward Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee began moving his Army of Northern Virginia to block that movement. Early and his division began moving east to join the rest of the army, and as they did, Early and his staff came near the old home of the former United States President James Madison, called Montpelier. The owner of the house, a Mr. Carson, invited the general and his staff to have dinner at the estate. The group of men were shown to the library and were treated very nicely, but as they sat in the library for an hour, then 2 hours, their stomachs began to growl. Finally, supper was announced, and the men went to the dining area where the 7 men were greeted by some biscuits, coffee, butter, and 5 eggs for the 7 men. Instead of the champagne hoped for by one of the staff members, they were given buttermilk. Early presumably ate an egg and sat there in silence, eating what food was provided, then got up, saying, "I'll be if I ain't going home and get something to eat." He and his staff quickly left the house and were on their way to Fredericksburg. As both armies gathered around that Virginia town, Early and his division remained in a supporting role to A.P. Hill and his division on the far right of the Confederate flank. On the morning of December 13, 1862, the Union division of George Gordon Meade attacked Hill's line. Hill's division had a large gap in the line because of the terrain, and Meade exploited it by busting through the hole and threatening to rout the entire division. Hill's troops were in support, and Early got a message from Jackson to move his division to the right. As his troops were moving, he got word from Hill's division that the line had been broken. Instead of following Jackson's orders, Early turned his brigades toward the breakthrough and charged into the blue-coated enemy, sending them running back toward the Rappahannock River. As Early's troops advanced, they yelled, "Here comes old Jubal! Let old Jubal straighten that fence! Jubal's boys are always getting Hill out of trouble." Early's overzealous brigades rushed forward and took significant punishment from Union artillery pieces trained on the open area they began to move through as they chased the Federals. Musketry also drove them back with horrible damage. Despite losing a lot of men in the attack, Early secured Jackson's line. On the Confederate left, Union forces wouldn't be as successful as they were on the right, and would launch attack after attack at Marye's Heights above the town. When the Union Army withdrew across the Potomac River and the destruction of Fredericksburg was apparent, Early's hatred for the Federals grew. He, Robert E. Lee, and cavalry leader Wade Hampton were together watching the Federals withdraw, and Early said that he wished all those men were dead. Lee chided him for his violent expression. Then Early said he did not wish they were all dead, but they would go home and mind their own business. When Lee rode off, out of earshot of the two men, Early turned to Hampton and said, "I not only wish them all dead, but I wish them all in hell." The winter from December 1862 into 1863 was a passive time as both armies remained in the Fredericksburg area, but no major movements were made, aside from Ambrose Burnside's infamous Mud March that ground to a halt in the wet winter months. But Early did receive good news. He was made a major general, cementing his rank and his command of Ewell's old division as his own. Early, who always insisted that private property be respected by his soldiers, kept getting reports that his Louisianians under Harry Hayes were doing just that, taking food, animals, and fence rails from good citizens. Early dictated a scathing order forbidding the men from Louisiana from taking anything more from the civilians. Hayes and the rest of his regimental commanders, aside from the commander of the 7th Louisiana, Davidson Penn, a native Virginian and friend to Early, signed a petition to be removed from Early's division and be placed under someone else. According to military protocol, the petition had to go up the chain of command, which meant it went through Early. Early called all the men together who signed and the one who didn't sign the petition and told them, "Gentlemen, this is the most remarkable document that I have had the honor to receive from you, but I am glad to see that there is one man of sense among you. Penn didn't sign it." Then in his high-pitched voice shouted, "Who do you think would have such a pack of thieves but me? If you can find any major general in this army such a fool as to take you fellows, you may go." The Louisianians burst into laughter that shook the whole tent, and Early broke out a jug of alcohol and poured it for the men. Their squabble had ended. A new brigade commander came into Early's division at this time as well, and it was one that would make a significant impact on Early's life during and after the war. John Brown Gordon, a Georgian who had been seriously wounded at Antietam, returned to the Army of Northern Virginia, and was given command of Alexander Lawton's old brigade of Georgians. Gordon and Early would work together well in the upcoming campaigns. In the wake of the horrible Union defeat at Fredericksburg, Abraham Lincoln replaced Ambrose Burnside with one of Early's West Point classmates, Joseph Hooker. The Union Army still remained outside of Fredericksburg, but by late April, Jeb Stuart discovered a large movement to the west by Hooker's army, but there remained a large segment of the army near Fredericksburg. Robert E. Lee took the bulk of his army west to confront Hooker in the wilderness around Chancellorsville, but he left Early and his division on the old Fredericksburg battlefield, keeping an eye on the Union forces still in that sector. Lee gave Early 3 directives as he commanded Fredericksburg. 1. Observe the Federals and pin down any forces that may cross the river, all the while concealing his own weakness, since the Union forces still at Fredericksburg at one point quadrupled his own, but would outnumber his force more than 2 to 1 through the entire battle. 2. If Early was overpowered, retreat toward Guinea Station to the south to protect the supplies and the railroad. 3. If Early found the Federals around Fredericksburg insignificant or moving toward Lee at Chancellorsville, to pull his own division out and reinforce Lee. One Union division had already crossed the Potomac River before Lee moved west, but Early monitored it, and it seemed inert. Early, from a high point on May 2, 1863, could see a large section of Union troops heading away from Fredericksburg, but he was still outnumbered 2 to 1 if the rest of the enemy decided to cross the river. Early had only 9,000 men to contend with over 20,000. On that same day, another West Point classmate of Early's, named Robert Chilton, came to Early with word that he was to send the majority of his artillery south. Out of over 50 artillery pieces, he was to only keep about 10 on the battlefield, then leave 1 brigade at Fredericksburg, while the rest of the division marched to reinforce Lee. Early and the Chief of Artillery, William Pendleton, and Lee's Chief of Staff, Robert Chilton, sat down on the ground and had an in-depth discussion about the orders. Early was perplexed. He asked why the majority of the artillery would have to go south. Chilton explained that Lee couldn't use the artillery in the thick underbrush of the wilderness, so it would be better to save it rather than bring it west. Early believed that his presence was keeping a large segment of the Union Army occupied, which was doing Lee a great service. Nevertheless, these new orders gave no leeway for Early to interpret them differently than Chilton explained them. Then a messenger rode up and declared that the Union division at the lower bridgehead that Early had been monitoring had abandoned its position. In reality, they had only concealed themselves from view. This seemed to indicate that what Chilton was saying was correct. Still puzzled, Early and Pendleton agreed to follow the orders. Early began pulling his troops out of their positions and began marching them toward the west. He was doing this at the same time Stonewall Jackson was moving his corps to hit the Union Army in the flank at Chancellorsville, an attack that would result in him being wounded by his own men. Early had gotten only a short distance away from Fredericksburg, but far enough away to allow the Union Army around that town to capture his works, when another messenger, not Chilton, rode up to Early. The instructions that Chilton gave Early were a misinterpretation by Chilton of what Lee said. Early was only to withdraw and join Lee if he could do so, without undue risk to his force or the rest of the army. Early began to curse Chilton unmercifully to his staff and what soldiers could hear him, but now he had a decision to make. Early assumed that the Federals had already taken the heights in his absence and ordered a forward march toward Lee. After about 20 minutes, another messenger rode up from Harry Hayes, commander of the Louisiana Brigade, that he left at Fredericksburg. It informed Early that John Sedgwick, the Union commander in that sector, was now crossing his entire force across the river, and if he didn't receive help, all the artillery would be captured once the enemy pressed forward. One of the brigades under Early, but not officially part of his division, the Mississippians under William Barksdale, had already turned around upon word that Hayes needed help, not waiting for orders from Early. Early couldn't sit idle. He quickly reversed his columns and marched back to the heights around Fredericksburg to throw back any Union advance against the position. Early's subordinates kept their division commander abreast of all information regarding the advance of the enemy. In the early morning of May 3rd, Sedgwick began to attack Early's line. On his way to the left, word came that Hayes's men had been pushed back a great distance from Mary's Heights, but had inflicted significant damage to the advancing Yankees. Nevertheless, Early now had to pull his right back to Cox's Farm, where the rest of the division was. Two circumstances unknown to Early kept his division from being pursued and possibly destroyed. First, Hooker kept sending messages to Sedgwick to attack Lee's rear, so to move west, neglecting to follow up on his victory against Early. Now Sedgwick would need to organize for an advance against Lee, which would take time. Second, Cadmus Wilcox, commanding a brigade of Alabamians, was on Early's extreme left, but Early didn't command him. He was under direct orders from Lee. When Hayes told Wilcox to fall back with them, Wilcox declined the suggestion and, seeing Sedgwick approach his position, began to delay the Union commander. Wilcox's plan worked great, and he was able to hold off Sedgwick until Lee could send more troops to block the approaching Federals. As Lee turned his attention to Sedgwick with another division, Lee ordered Early to cooperate with Richard Anderson's division in smashing Sedgwick's force, but by the time that Anderson was ready to attack, it was late on May 4th, and although there was a little fight, Sedgwick recrossed the river during the night. Chancellorsville was a great victory for Lee, and Early played a significant role. One of Early's biographers explained, "The critical role Lee counted on him to play would have daunted all but a handful of senior generals in the army. Never truly perturbed, even at the worst time, the garbled orders, the loss of the heights, Jubal had to cope with a situation that was not only intimidating but highly complicated. It would not have been surprising if he had made mistakes, but he made no significant error." The victory at Chancellorsville came at a terrible loss in the death of Stonewall Jackson. He had been wounded by his own men and died of pneumonia a few days later. Robert E. Lee would reorganize the army after Jackson's death, making the newly arrived Richard Ewell, Early's old division commander, and A.P. Hill both corps commanders. Early would be placed in Ewell's corps. Soon, Lee would take the offensive, driving north on another invasion. Early's men in Ewell's corps spearheaded the invasion. As they moved down the Shenandoah Valley toward the Potomac River, they came to Winchester, Virginia. Knowing that many of the men from the 13th Virginia was from the area, Early asked them to take the lead and scout the area. The captain of Company H came up to Early and said he and his boys would clean out the town themselves if Early would let them go see their sweethearts. Early said that he would see about it, then rode on. That same captain, Captain Samuel Buck, scouted ahead himself and observed the earthworks constructed by Federal soldiers. When bullets began to whiz by his head, He decided to pull back and inform Early about the situation. Early wanted to view the situation himself and rode to the front. He wanted to get closer than Buck got, and Buck warned him about the danger, but Early asked him to remove the top rails of a fence, leaving the bottom so he could cross. Early put his horse to the fence and wanted him to jump the bottom rail from a standing position. The horse basically refused to, and half jumped so that his front legs crossed the rail, but his back legs didn't. Buck remembered that, in this healthy position, the enemy saw us, and the way the bullets whizzed about us is still indelibly impressed in my mind, and the way the general lifted his horse back from the fence convinced me that he was satisfied, and we both retreated to the edge of the woods, he cursing the Yankees at every step. Turning to me sharply, he said, "Buck, you stay here with your men and watch this point, reporting any move of the enemy, and I will relieve you." As he rode off again, he turned and began to curse the Yankees, saying, "I will attend to them. You wait until you hear my signal gun, and you will see some fun from this point." Moving Gordon's brigade to Bowers Hill outside of Winchester, the Georgian distracted the Union forces while Early maneuvered his troops to the north and west of the town, poised to attack some earthworks constructed by the garrisoned Federals. In a rapid dash by Harry Hayes's Louisianians, they captured the first earthwork, then began to work their way around toward the other two, with the Union soldiers retreating in great haste from the approaching rebels. Robert Milroy, the Union garrison commander, and some of his staff got away on horses and mules cut from wagons and artillery pieces. The Second Battle of Winchester was seen by the men of Ewell's corps as a masterful achievement and one of the most complete victories of the war, with the Confederates capturing a multitude of supplies badly needed. Ewell left Early to Winchester to organize the movement of material to the rear. After 2 days, Early was to join Ewell as they entered Pennsylvania. Ewell's corps was to be the first rebel troops to enter the North as part of the Gettysburg Campaign.